Let's do a quick deep dive into human security and understanding how that fits into wider environment security, climate security contexts. It's one that has specifically um, come out of an opening that happened 30 plus years ago with the end of the Cold War. And so this notion of security that had been so tied to traditional foreign policy, security competition between the United States and the Soviet Union suddenly had lots more space for a wider discussion. And so in the early 1990s, through a UN process, we had this notion of human security that was enunciated in its kind of best known terms. And so the UN Development Program in 1994, as part of a report that they issued every year, had a chapter on human security. It was the first time that it had been kind of put together in this fashion. And it really moved away from just being concerned about security as the security of countries, of states, and to go above and below the level of the state and to really focus particularly on individuals and communities and think about that in a more positive term of freedom from fear and freedom from want as core elements of what we should be trying to achieve with security. It had an addition with a Commission on Human Security work done 9 years later that also added freedom to live in dignity. And so you see some reflections of a larger focus on justice and equity being more even explicitly integrated in a security discussion where often it is not prominent. So what did they offer as a definition or the constituent parts of human security, which was really kind of how they went about defining it? And as you can see, it is a list of 7: economic, food, health, environmental, personal, community, and political security. So a couple things to take away. One, the environment. And at this time, it was primarily framed as the environment. It wasn't really till 2007 that climate and security was prominently enunciated. But environment had a seat at the table. It was seen as one critical element to understanding what it was that threatened security that focused on individuals and community and well-being that went far beyond insecurity that might come from the end of a gun, so to speak. But you can also see that it inherently connects these issues of health and economics and food along with environment and personal security that and community security, political security that had very explicit engagement with um, questions of violence, but not just those of invading armies, but kind of in an individual and household level as well. And so this was really offered as an alternative framework where we focus, where we see challenges, but also meant a lot about making a bid for prioritizing different types of projects and programs to deliver security. It was about budgets, it was about priorities, and so it was, while in a sense a conceptual exercise, it also very much was a practical exercise that again was meant to be more inclusive of countries in all and locations in all shapes and sizes, so to speak, and kind of moving away from this dominance of the US and Soviet East and West and kind of an undifferentiated two camps. So part of what this human security frame offers us, particularly as we look at climate and security and climate related risk, but broadly, some of these tenets that get at the, I would say, more nuanced versions of risk that we're engaging with, but that it's people centered as opposed to kind of country centered and really connected to how people are living and exercising choice and rights, accessing opportunities. And so in that way has a direct connection to how some of the climate related risk affects those dimensions. But
goes down to an individual level in ways that sometimes we don't always make it. This kind of key notion of interdependence around risk. So these different components of human security are connected and can't not just be treated individually in isolation in how we analyze them and how we respond to them. And that really taking a human security perspective also puts the onus on prevention and early action, as opposed to waiting till the crisis is played out and in a more humanitarian and just strictly response perspective. So it really tries to um, engage with precautionary principles that are familiar in environmental policymaking in ways that really emphasize both the need to do that proactively, also the efficacy and the cost effectiveness of being early in intervening and responding rather than just responding to crises once they've happened. And that, as I said, and this may seem very straightforward, but that it's a universal concern, and it is an arena, this human security frame, where all players, all locations, and a much wider set of stakeholders are need to be at the table and have tools in their toolboxes that apply in ways that go far beyond a traditional security frame. It also, by adopting a human security approach, allows us to not only look at vulnerabilities, but get at some of the questions of agency and the ability to act and be engaged by some of those communities that, in the climate case, are often listed as vulnerable groups and most affected, as we've discussed, but are not always part of putting together and being part of the solution. And so the human security approach really tries to emphasize that when engaging with government and non-governmental, public and private, for-profit, not-for-profit organizations that be tackling these issues. It again really recognizes the importance of the diversity of stakeholders who are playing a part in providing human security and responding. So in that security context and moving away from that traditional security institution that really was the sole arena of the ability of use of force, whether that's a domestic police department or military in the international context. And then it puts a big emphasis on power and emphasizing power relations and stressing the importance of mapping out those patterns in order to have a good sense of where the shortcomings are, where the opportunities are, and making sure that our responses aren't just reinforcing those power inequalities, rather that they need to be transformative. So how does human security connect explicitly with climate change and climate security approaches? Well, it did most prominently in about 2010 when they set the agenda, picked the chapters for the fifth assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so for the first time, this comprehensive review of the science and the responses to climate change is done by usually 800 plus scientists drawn from all over the world. This assessment, the fifth one, coming out in 2014, was going to assess human security as a frame for understanding what the links were between climate change and security. That was a purposeful decision to use human security, and at the same time, not a controversial one. And I can say from experience, because I had the privilege of being one of the co-authors of this chapter, so participated in 4 years of reviewing the literature, setting the so-called table of contents within the chapter. What is it that we were going to look at? That there were still really hot debates, even within our chapter authors, about whether it was a mandate to focus on what had been historically, and you could still say still is the case most often, the focus on questions around, does conflict is it affected by climate change? Is climate change a driver, a contributor to conflict, and often violent conflict on kind of high levels of violence? And so that was clear that it was going to be part of the chapter. But I think the intent of those organizing the whole report, and certainly the consensus eventually of those of us writing the chapter, was that the human security frame very explicitly endorsed a more robust agenda than just that question about conflict, in part because there are a lot of still ambiguous questions about conflict and climate change, complex for sure, but that there were a number of wider set of questions. And so in that chapter, human security, we very explicitly dove straight into the economic and livelihoods impacts and what that means for individuals, for households, for communities, for countries, and really made that connection with that economic security dimension of human security from a climate perspective. We would have spent a lot more time on health, but there were extensive treatments of health and climate change in other parts of the report. Culture was one where we were consistently asked all chapters to understand what climate change in the context of the chapter meant for Indigenous peoples and such, but it really went far beyond that, as well as central as climate and culture were. Migration and mobility, one that you will often hear as a primary focus, in part because it's hugely important, hugely complex, lends itself to some oversimplification headlines and short versions of it. So you might have heard of the climate refugees, for example, a quite fraught term, in part because people move for more than one reason. So a single adjective is difficult to describe it. Yet it's absolutely critical and a very rational adaptation strategy in the face of environmental change to move. And so this was a big part of the assessment. And then this wider geopolitics, and we'll see some examples of how the geopolitics plays out when we talk about backdraft dynamics and a just and peaceful transition. So a full agenda within this chapter for human security within the IPCC. I should say it's important to note that one other IPCC assessment, the sixth assessment, has come out since. Human security was not a chapter in and of itself. Many of the issues were addressed, but this kind of debate between giving it its own chapeau, its own umbrella, its own chapter, versus integrating it across, I do think that a lot of the topics are dealt with, yet you lose some of the frame and the focus without having that chapter in the current one. But in a sense, then, applying a human security frame does give a way to engage with climate security and approaches in the United States and internationally in ways that go beyond the narrow construction of the topic, climate security topic, and which for some is really a focus on climate conflict. It is definitely an opportunity to bridge to key institutions, tools, budgets that are in that traditional security and humanitarian space. Those are critical actors, both for addressing the challenges, but also for resources and tools that they regularly engage with that could also be useful and bring in. So tabletop exercises, scenarios, and such that are kind of day-to-day primary tools of those worlds are increasingly used in the climate risk space, I think, to good effect. Now, we talked about the origins coming from the UN in 1994 for the human security frame. And so, like many UN initiatives, when we think about how it is or isn't explicitly playing out and organizing efforts within the United States, it's definitely one where the ideas are there. It's not typically up front, it's typically behind. And so we look to these places for conceptual inspiration and understanding, even if it is not giving us the specific
tools, or we're not utilizing tools coming from that institution and its many manifestations. But there are quite a few that are there and quite productive. And then I think it's important to also, at the end of the day, recognize that this is still a very contested space, even putting these things together. So I met, 30 years ago, a fascinating peace researcher from Finland who wrote a book called Greening Security or Militarizing the Environment, question mark. And so under what has become a subtopic of climate security, environment security, of securitization, suggests that, in fact, we're not necessarily going to productively bring in those tools and perspectives and apply them in um, the the kind of environment or climate space, but instead we're going to militarize or securitize the responses so that we actually end up constraining our um, topical focus and the tools that are deemed appropriate. It's a contested discussion, one that I think is worth having, can easily lead to hyperbole in both directions or multiple directions. But nevertheless important to ask and have front and center. And so finally, there are lots and lots of ways to follow up on different aspects of this. I thought it would be useful to highlight some of the key ones. These are primarily a list of kind of applied research institutes that are engaging with people on the ground, trying to learn from what folks are doing, trying to share lessons learned, develop some of the approaches to respond, and some of the tools like the weathering risk tool that we'll look at in specific, developed by the folks at Adelphi Research in Berlin. But it's a wide range and could be a very long list. This photo here, extra bonus, so to speak, if you know who this is. It was definitely one of my career highlights the day facilitated this discussion. And so we'll leave that a mystery, although there's a clue there in the list.